And welcome back. In the last video we installed our intake and several of the electrical connections and started relaying our wiring harness kind of in place where it needs to go. And this next video we're going to start with our alternator. And if you're reinstalling the same alternator you had, at least on this model, and several of them will actually do this, not all though, you'll see these little metal sleeves that as you tighten the bolt, these sleeves get pushed out and they pinch up against the mounting bracket, which is kind of how it secures itself. And because you'll notice when you take the bolts out, if you watch the uninstall video, and most alternators will do this, you kind of have to rock them and get them to move a little bit because they're still kind of pinched in place, so to speak, even once you get the bolts out. But to aid in installation, it's sometimes easier to push these spacers back in just a little bit on in this case, both of these. It'll help that alternator slide in place better. And to show you what I'm doing is I have this just sitting on a wooden block, just so it's not sitting on the bare table, and I'm being mindful of you know, our main electrical connector there on the back, as well as our plastic connector there. I just want to make sure I don't damage it. But if I flip the alternator over onto the other side, what I'm using is just a C-clamp and a block of wood to protect everything. And I'm going to put the block of wood up against that spacer and just put a little bit of pressure on it this way and kind of push that bushing in a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause you, get you into a tripod, and I'll bring you back and show you what I mean. Talk to you in a minute. Okay, welcome back. I got you in tripod, got you zoomed in as much as I can onto the ear there. So once again, I'm just going to take this block of wood, place it in there, and then take our C-clamp, and I'm just going to kind of come at this at an angle. Let me pick you up a little bit so hopefully you can kind of see what's going on here. Tell you what, let me just put pressure on here to hold this. I'm going to move you over. Try to get you in there where you can see that spacer. It's sticking out just ever so slightly. There we go. Sorry, I gotta get a better angle on this. It's a little cumbersome to do with a C-clamp because you can't get on it straight, but you can get on here generally straight enough. There we go. Now hopefully I'm going to put a little bit of pressure in on this. Not too much. Oop, I slipped off. There we go. That's what I want. Okay. And you'll notice it's going to be kind of hard to see, but you'll notice that spacer has now been pushed in just ever so slightly from what it was before. Now what we might be able to do is push that in just a hair more. And again, it's kind of hard to do with this particular C-clamp because the C-clamp, as you'll notice, is missing the suction end, the little suction cup end on it, the little flat end on it that it should have on it. And you can do this with a big pair of channel locks if you have them. Okay. Oh, nice. Okay, yeah, we got it in just a little bit more, and that should do it. I know it doesn't look like it moved much, but it wasn't out much of this collar. But this, in conjunction with this one, the other ear that we did push back just a little bit as well. You'll notice this one is. Let me get you in the shot because I got you zoomed in. So you kind of horrible view. You'll notice this one I got pushed in a fair bit further because it's nice and flush with this one. So this, in conjunction with the little bit we pushed in on that ear, that spacer, should allow us just to easily kind of slip this alternator back into its bracket. So we're going to go ahead and do that now, and I'll bring you back once it's in there. One moment. And welcome back. So I just wanted to show you that here with those spacers pushed out. If you watch this, you see that alternator just literally just slides. You'll see that one hinge pin right there. That's where one bolt should go. You'll notice, unlike taking it out, where we kind of had to wiggle it and rock it a little bit, I can pick that alternator up and pull it right out of there. But once we get those bolts in and we tighten it up and it pulls those spacers back in, that'll cinch it to that bracket. So we're going to go ahead and take care of that now, and then we'll bring you back once it's complete. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see we have our alternator installed. I'm going to go grab me a Sharpie so I can mark those bolts as being torqued. And per the guide I have, the main alternator bolts, meaning this guy here and this guy here, 37 foot-pounds is what the book that I have calls for those to be. So they've been torqued to 37 foot-pounds. You can see that we've got our rear positive that goes to our battery connected, and we've got our signal wire connected as well. On this main positive, put your bolt in, and I'll go look at the manual, but the manual I have states 106 inch-pounds for that, which isn't very much. So no need to do a full ugga-dugga on that one. Just get the bolt on there and get it snug. Put it on hand tight and just cinch it a little bit to make it nice and snug, and it should be good to go. You don't want to over torque that and risk breaking that stud, or worse, or also potentially not breaking the stud, but also breaking the electrical connection on the inside of the alternator for that main positive. So as you can see, we've got our alternator in, we've got it cabled up. So it's starting to look like an engine again. There we go. So what I'm going to put in next is the big AC bracket. And this bracket, we took it off when we did the alternator. It's this bracket here. This is the one that goes onto our air conditioning lines. And if you remember, you'd see where that sensor is and where you have that port right there for a coolant line. There's a double-ended stud that end goes onto. It then comes up and clips around the two AC lines where we made our red marks, if you remember, when we deinstalled it. And then the final bolt goes through the centerpiece here and into our intake housing here. And the bolt, or the nut needed for this double-ended stud, if you remember, when we deinstalled it, since the thread fit, in order to keep track of it, we just threaded it onto the bolt that would normally bolt into here. So that's the nut for our stud here. That's the bolt that it'll bolt into. And of course, you remember where we marked our two lines for that bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and get that bracket installed, and then I'll bring you back. Thank you much. Welcome back. Small update. You can see we got our bracket installed. So again, this was the bracket that held our two air conditioning lines securely. And again, it was a double stud, which had a nut, which went to this stud, which is below the coolant connection here and kind of diagonal below the sensor. The nut went here. The bolt went through and threaded into a threaded insert on the intake. And as you can see, these lines just go in place, and then this top plastic part pushes forward and then clips. So what we're going to do next is grab our bolts for our power steering, and we're going to go ahead and get that installed. And if I recall correctly, let's see, power steering pump install. So it says refer to torque specifications, and it looks like power steering pump mounting bolts gets 21 foot-pounds. So I'm going to go grab the bag of bolts that pertain to that. I'll get them installed and I'll bring you back. Thank you. And welcome back. So you can see we've got our power steering pump reinstalled at this point. And I didn't film it, just like I didn't film the alternator one, because it's literally, in this case, it's a matter of just lining it back up and putting 3 bolts in and you're done. Just a little tip, just like we did with the uninstall though, just rotate the power steering pump until one of the holes in the power steering pump lines up with the bolt that you need, and you can get a socket through there and get those off just fine. But just to reiterate what we were talking about earlier, the torque specification, at least per all data, and again, it's all data, so take it with a grain of salt, power steering pump mounting bolts were 21 foot-pounds, so that's what we torqued them to. So we've got that piece in at this point. So that brings us to alternator being done, power steering pump obviously being done, and I did confirm, I may have mentioned this in an earlier video, but I did confirm that this is the correct orientation for this bracket. There is a cooling hose that will come clip onto the side one, route around here in kind of a 90-degree bend, route over here, and then end up plugging into that point there. And we'll get to that when we do the cooling installs. But with that being done, with that being said, since I know this piece is where it needs to be and we've got everything buttoned up here, I'm going to go ahead and clean up this surface here coming off our EGR valve and go ahead and replace this gasket as well. So we have a new gasket here and a new gasket here, and then we'll get our EGR pipe to our intake reinstalled. So that'll be the next piece. Once that's complete, we'll go ahead and see about getting our crank pulley reinstalled. And if you remember when we uninstalled it, we got a unique kind of item that we have to account for, is that the crank's been pinned, and it's been pinned because of the necessity of needing it that way due to having the supercharger installed. So we're going to have to figure out a way that when we put that pulley on there, to get it lined up in such a way that we do get it lined up, and you'll see that's our stainless steel pin there, we get it lined up in such a way that we get that channel lined up with the channel in the crank. So I've got an idea that I think might work. What I'm going to do is just take a Sharpie and draw out the edges of this groove all the way back, and then be able to use those lines to line up with the side grooves for the corresponding channel on the crank. And then we should be able to press it in place and be where we need to be. But that's going to be interesting. I did buy a tool that I may use if it looks like it'll do the job. It's not the Chrysler tool for installing the harmonic balancer. It is an OEM tools version of it that if it looks like it'll thread into the crank without causing any issues, we'll try it. Basically what it is, it's just an extra long bolt or forcing screw that threads into the crank just like the crank bolt would, except it's got a the forcing part of it is just a bearing with a nut on top. And what it does is as you tighten that down, it'll spin on that bearing, but it'll do basically it'll push forward onto this pulley, pushing it onto the crank. Now, if I don't like the way the forcing screw looks, or if the kit they sent me actually doesn't work or doesn't thread into the crank properly, then what we'll do is we'll just use the crank pulley bolt which is, yeah, I know a lot of people say it's not recommended to do it that way, but there are a lot of other videos, to include Reignited's videos, where he did that. And as long as you can get, and I agree with him, as long as you can get 6 to 7 threads of that bolt on there and get a nice, good, meaty grab on it, then you're safe to draw it in the rest of the way. Again, in my opinion, to each their own. So if I have to, what we may do first is get this on the crank, put a block of wood on it, and just tap on it and tap it down as far as we can, so that way when we thread the bolt in, we get that 6 to 7 threads or a nice meaty grab in there before we attempt to use the crank bolt to draw that in. But with that being said, like I said, we'll get to work on this pulley. Actually, we'll get to work on that EGR tube first. Once that's done, we'll get to work on the pulley. But again, let me just grab that tube here. There it is. Speak of the devil. And again, I have to say that the next project, not an if, but the next project we do, I'll definitely be bagging and tagging these parts again. This has been so convenient just to be able to grab a particular bag and have all its hardware right there ready for the install. I'll definitely be doing this again. But now that we've got this piece, I'll go ahead and work on getting that new gasket on there, and we'll get this reinstalled, and then I'll bring you back when it's complete. But again, I think I showed this in the previous video, but that is the part number there, and this is the gasket that goes between this flange. This is the piece that goes into the intake, so that's the flange that mates up with the EGR valve flange here, the other side of that flange that we need to clean up before we put that gasket in place. But I'm going to go ahead and get that surface cleaned up, and I'll get that installed, and I'll bring you back and show you what it looks like. Talk to you in a bit. Bye.
And welcome back. So in the previous video, you saw us fit the alternator, the water pump, the alternator and the power steering pump, and get a few more of our brackets in place for our AC lines and such. So what you're staring at now is we're sitting underneath the truck. Again, the radiator's still removed, so it permits us some ample room to do this. That's obviously the crankshaft snout that you see there, and we're prepping to try to get this crank pulley installed. And as I mentioned in the previous clip, you can see where the crank has been drilled part of the way in order to get pinned. Now, just like we showed on the pulley, it's going to be a little bit dark, I apologize. You can see the pulley, you can see that line doesn't go all the way through, but I didn't attempt to make some marks with a green Sharpie here on the very edge to tell where those edges of that groove are at. Because we've got to get that groove that you see there lined up with that one on the crank, so that when we press this in place, we can put our pin back in. Now, worst case scenario, you could take the same drilling rig that they sent with the pinning kit and just pin the crank in a different spot. And if we absolutely can't get it to line up, I may consider doing that. But I'm going to try to get this lined up to where we can use the original pinning point. This is the tool that I was telling you about in the previous clip. And this is put out by OEM Tools, and it does Chrysler, GM, and Ford. And for Chrysler, they had two different thread of basically forcing screws, or bolts if you want to call them that. And this one fits. This one threads into the crank just fine. I've got everything thoroughly lubed up with just some Lucas grease, just to give it some lubrication as it's pushing that in place. I dropped a little bit of oil inside the force nerve bearing there. Again, cleaned up the crankshaft, put a little bit of oil on the outside of that, and again, just a little bit of oil on the inside of this bore. For this crank pulley. Again, just trying to give everything the best opportunity to go together nice and easy. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and see about getting this pulley lined up and getting it started, and hopefully we can get everything lined up to where it needs to be. and we don't have to pull it off and, you know, try it a second or a third time. And hopefully we don't have to drill it to a different position. But again, I'm going to try to get this stuff lined up, and then I'll bring you back and we'll see how it goes. Thank you much. Okay, welcome back. I just want to show you this real quick. I'm in the process of trying to get this crank lined up, and you can see that I can actually see the two holes pretty well from where this is at. Hopefully that's focusing in. Okay, there is a lot of light in here. I apologize. I'm liking where that's sitting, so I'm going to drive that in a little bit and kind of see how that's lining up, and then we'll go from there. But basically I've got myself propped up so I can get a pretty good straight shot of being able to visually see this. But hopefully you can see that okay, and then we're going to continue on and I'll bring you back. Thank you much.
And welcome back. So I tried a few times to get the crank pulley in the position where the old pin location would line up, and inevitably what would always happen is that just as the crank pulley was being pushed in place, it would rotate just ever so slightly and kind of throw it out of position. So since I still have the original pinning kit that came with the Pro Charger, which is a high-speed steel bit, drill bit, as well as the adapter. So what this is that you remove your crank pulley, replace it with this jig, and that jig has a hole in there, obviously for the drill bit, as a guide for the drill bit. According to, and this is just for my model, it may be for others, but according to Pro Charger, they want you to make a tape mark 1 5/8 inches back from the end of the bit. So what you're going to do, you're going to use that as a guide. So you're going to drill in basically into this adapter, which will drill into the face of the crank, and you're going to stop when you get to the tape mark, and then you can insert your pin again. So I'm going to just go ahead and repin this crank because it would be far easier and less stressful on the crank than to keep trying to back that pulley out and put it back in and out and back in. It's not going to hurt it that it has a pin location there with no pin in it, because again, that it's not really lined up to get a pin in it. Individuals will sometimes, even on their own personal vehicles, put as many as 2 pins or more into their crank. So it doesn't bother me that there's going to be a little bit of a hole there with no pin in it. It'll be just fine. And I think this, again, I just think this will be the easier and less stressful route, just to go ahead and drill it, repin it, and be done with it. But just to show you, I'm waiting for a drill battery to charge at this point, and we'll begin. But you can see that we've got our crank pulley on there. And this utility, it did work. This is the one from OEM Tools, and I'll put a link in the description, but you know, kind of use it to your judgment, because you can see the ring that that as this utility was pushing on that crank, it started to cut into this side of this bearing surface, this little metal adapter, or I don't think that's the bearing surface. I think that's just like a thin metal shell they have around the forcing nut and the bearing underneath. But you can see it started to cut a groove into this. So what I ended up doing was just using this to get the crank pulley started. So that way it pushed it onto the crank enough that I could get a good, 10, 12 threads in with the actual crank bolt. Then I used the old crank bolt to literally just drive it in by hand, and it didn't take any more force than that. Again, we lubed up the inside of the crank bore and the outside of the crankshaft, which probably did help. But again, used this to start it, backed it out. Once I verified that we had that 10 or so threads in using an actual crank bolt, I was able to just use a 1/2 inch ratchet and work it the rest of the way in by hand. And just like others have said online, you know that you're on far enough and that you're completely on when you go to tighten it and actually starts trying to turn the engine over. So at that point, I went ahead and took our old bolt out, and going to go ahead and prep this thing to pin this crank again. And I'll bring you back and show you kind of what that looks like. And Oh, you might be able to see it there. Yeah, you might be able to see that that hole is just the crank pulley just slightly shifted on me, but enough that that pin's not going to go in there. And I don't want to put the utility in there and drill that hole out, because then it's going to elongate it, which means that pin's going to be allowed to kind of rock from side to side. So I want that pin to be, you know, stable and where it needs to be. So at this point in time, like I said, we're just waiting for a drill battery to charge, and then we'll get to pinning this crank, and hopefully be done with this today. I'll go ahead, like I said, you can see it on the charger here. Once this is done, I'll get the drilling. Once I get the drilling complete, I'll bring you back. I am going to use some WD-40 with this bit. And last time I did this, I'm going to do the same thing. I would periodically stop, take the bit out to allow any chips and shavings to come out of the hole, and then squirt the bit down with a little bit of oil, again, just to keep it well lubricated so you're not, you know, drilling this dry and potentially burning your drill bit up. But I'm going to go ahead and get that taken care of. I'll bring you back right before I start the drilling process just to show you how this jig gets set up, and I'll talk to you then. Thank you much. Bye. And welcome back. So you can see that we've got our jig in place. Again, it just threads in just like the crank bolt does, and just kind of, you know, hand tighten it down. No need to, you know, put an impact or anything on that. But as you can see, if you remember, we had our old hole down here, so I just went up a little bit, and that's where I'm going to drill through. I'm going to test. I'm just going to use a full-size drill because we've got the radiator out of here, so I should be able to do that without having to get a right angle drill in here. But if you're doing this in your vehicle and you haven't removed the radiator, or you don't want to, you don't necessarily have to, but because of the clearance of the radiator, you may have to put a right angle drill on it to do this. So we've got our bit marked at our 1 5/8 position per the instructions. I've got some tape in there to tell me when to stop drilling, and I went ahead and shot a little bit of WD-40 down in that hole just to kind of prep things. So like I did last time, I'm going to go ahead and start drilling this, and periodically I'll back the bit out just to allow any shavings to fall out. And then once we hit the tape, I'll go ahead and take the adapter off, and then we should be able to pin things and you know, get the new crank bolt in, and you know, hopefully wrap this thing up. But I'll bring you back in a bit. Talk to you later. Bye. And welcome back. So we're up to our tape. So I'm going to stop drilling at this point. Now, I did have to reposition the adapter, as you see. So again, I'm not going to edit this out. What had happened was that adapter wasn't tight enough, and when I started drilling that second hole, that adapter actually shifted downward, which means it wasn't drilling in the right spot. So I had to clock it over, as you can see, and redo my drill. So there's a partial little nub of a hole in there that, you know, unfortunately it is what it is. I didn't have that little guide in there tight enough, and it allowed it to shift downward. So again, learn from my mistakes. Make sure that if you're going to be doing this procedure, that you have that guide in there nice and tight, and that it doesn't shift on you. But we were able to get our hole drilled. As you can see from all the shavings, what I would do is I would go in a little bit, back to drill out to allow all the shavings to clear, and then periodically pull the bit completely out, sprayed the bit down with some WD-40, and shoot some WD-40 in the hole. Again, just making sure that, wanted to make sure that we didn't prematurely, you know, dull our bit so that we can get our hole completed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull that adapter out, and then I'll bring you back and show you what it looks like. Talk to you in a bit. Bye. And welcome back. So you can see our hole there in the kind of upper right. I went ahead and shot some oil in there. I put a small piece of shop cloth down the bore where the crank bolt goes, just to make sure that no shavings dropped in there by accident, because the engine is angled backward a little bit. So I shot some oil down in there, and then shot some compressed air in there just to clear it out. You can see where I was talking about earlier, where we started re-drilling that, and you can see that it's not centered. It should look like that second hole does, where half of the moon is on the crank pulley itself and the other half is in the crank. So you can see where that adapter slipped on me, and I'm glad it just did it early and I was able to catch it early and didn't go, you know, full on with it. But at this point, we should be able to put our pin in. Being a little bit of a pain. Okay, okay, so I'm going to work on that a little bit. Looks like it may be a little bit of a burr in there, so I'm just going to run the drill bit through it just to clear that hole out, and then I'll go ahead and put this pin in. But I'll bring you back. But I'll bring you back when I get the pin in, because it's fighting me a little bit. This pin should be flush with this surface here once it seats, because remember the crank bolt in our case has a big old washer that sits here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to work on this pin a bit, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see we've got our pin in. Yeah, there was a little bit of a burr on the inside of the hole that we drilled, so I just put the drill bit in there and very lightly kind of went over the outside edge, remove the burr. And also on the pin, since it was the previous pin, it had a little burr on it, so I just used a little bit of green Scotch-Brite and kind of scoured over the outside of that pin to polish it up. And then we were able to get it in, as you see there. I did tap it just ever so slightly on the final little bit to get it to seat flush. But we're good at this point. So we can go ahead and finish cleaning this up, which I'll do, and I'll go ahead and get our crank bolt in, and we'll look to getting this torqued. And I'm going to use the torque out of the Pro Charger manual as opposed to the torque that was in the book specification. It's only a few foot-pounds off of factory, but since this is their pin and it is a Pro Charge setup, I'm going to use their setting, which is why I'm doing that. But I'm going to go ahead and take care of this, and I'll bring you back. Matter of fact, let me show you that. I can show you the part number for the bolt. I showed this in a previous video, but in case you're curious, that's the part number for, again, comes up for our 6.4 and our 2500. And it does match our factory bolt. So we're going to go ahead and again we'll get this cleaned up, we'll get it in, we'll get it torqued, and then we'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see that we got our crank pulley installed. You saw in the previous clip the procedure. We went through the pin went ahead and finished up our EGR cooler assembly, which was the pipe that went from the EGR valve into the intake. So we cleaned off the face of that EGR valve and replaced that gasket, and then replaced the O-ring that was on the intake side of it. The O-ring came in the upper seal intake kit along with all of the other seals. You saw it in the previous clip, and we went over the part number for this particular seal here. So that's been done, that's in, that's tightened. Our crank is tightened at this point. Because of the extra length of time that it took, because due to us having to go over pinning the crank, which is not something I had accounted for, and it's my bad. To keep this video from getting any longer, I'll go ahead and cut it at this point, and then the next video that we come back with, we'll proceed forward with getting the radiator reinstalled, all the coolant pipes and hoses installed. After that, it's just a matter of cleaning up some incidentals, hooking up our fuel line, vacuum line for our purge solenoid, coil packs, getting our spark plugs installed. Again, just kind of wrapping it up type items. So probably one more video, I would think, showing the install of items, again, which will be the before mentioned radiator and the other accessories. And then the video after that should be us updating the tune and the PCM and giving it a start attempt. And that'll be the interesting one. It'll either work or pieces will fly out of the side of the engine block and land on the ground. Either way, it should make for good content. But with that being said, I'll let you go, and I'll bring you back for the next one. Thank you much.